Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast for February 15th, 2024. My name's Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
I'm Peter Ryan in Montreal. Mark, great to see you and hope that the midpoint of February is going well for you. We're now halfway through the quarter.
Well, couldn't you imagine that? It was only recently that we were chatting away with Leanne and Steve Lloyd doing Welcome to the New Year podcast. And now we're talking about the first quarter almost being over.
Yeah, I know. It's so much has happened, both from the CX standpoint as well as the broader news cycle, what's going on in the world. It just beggars belief how quickly you just see time flying by as you get into the year. But, we're very fortunate this week to be talking with somebody as we look at CX and moving forward, somebody who's got an amazing eye to the world. Now, this is somebody who's got a tremendous background in the customer experience management space. It's Rob Dwyer, who joined me from his home in Kansas as we chatted most recently. Rob is somebody who has got, I think, a lot in common with us because he's a CX podcaster. And this is what we chatted a little bit about over the course of my 15-20 minute discussion with Rob. His podcast is called Next in Queue. He's been curating it now for a couple of years, and he's very quickly developed a very large following. He talks to people, much like we do in the CX space, about different issues, different challenges, different trends he's seeing. So I got into it with Rob to talk a little bit about what some of the big challenges are that he's picking up in the interviews that he's conducting, what he's seeing in terms of the key points around technology, around service delivery from the perspective of different business models, and more or less where he sees the space going over 2024 and beyond. An absolutely delightful guy who I will also say, Mark, would challenge you for one of the coolest backdrops in terms of the area where he records. You've got some amazing posters on the wall. Rob had a Millennium Falcon, an Imperial Walker, 4 pictures of the Beatles, but all done out of Lego.
Well, I haven't got Lego behind me, but you can see a ZX Spectrum by Sinclair and some original art by the artist Happitu. So, I'm trying my best.
Well, you're succeeding as well. I think that you and Rob will be in a race for the coolest backdrops during a Zoom discussion. But the fact of the matter is, we got into a few different topics. We discussed the challenges related to non-voice delivery, and what I think everybody is realizing is just an epic fail in terms of how enterprises are managing this. We talked a little bit about how the BPO community and the CX technology community players can distinguish themselves in very crowded and increasingly generic markets. And we also discussed a little bit about what's going on with Gen AI and what some of the expectations were versus how reality's played out. So an absolutely great chat, and I'm sure it's one that everybody in the podcast verse is going to appreciate.
That's great. And of course, one of the things that we all find when you're in analysis or podcasting or even business journalism is that you get to meet so many interesting people and you hear views from the sell side, the buy side, the technology side. And so it can be useful to sort of synthesize those opinions because you've heard from so many people in the industry.
That's it. And one of the things I've always liked working as an analyst and as a podcaster has been the fact that, you talk to 1 or 2 people and you can start to see broad trend lines coming out. You talk to 3 or 4, you can start to see narrow trend lines. You talk to 5 or 6, you start to see very, very defined trends happening. And I think this is exactly as you say, whether it's the buy side, whether it's the sell side, whether it's parallel universes such as CX tech. You talk to enough people, you're going to start seeing definite delineation about where the industry is going. And with that in mind, let's go to hear what Rob had to say in the interview, and we can get a sense about where he's picking up CX is going to go in 2024.
Okay, great.
One of the things that the CX Files really enjoys doing is catching up with fellow podcasters. And obviously in the customer experience domain, there are a lot. But one that's really stood out to me over the course of the past while is Next in Queue. Now, this is curated by my guest today, Rob Dwyer, who is the Vice President of Customer Engagement at Happitu. Rob, you're joining us from your home. And for those who can't see, for those of us who are listening and not actually able to visualize, which is everybody because this is an audio-based podcast, I think you probably win the prize for the coolest background I've ever seen. I'm seeing Lego pictures of the Beatles. I am seeing a Millennium Falcon, an Imperial Walker, various Star Wars characters. And with that in mind, this is going to be not just a feast for the ears, but definitely a visual feast for the eyes when we consider our shared love of Star Wars that we were discussing prior to hitting the record button. But thanks for taking some time to join us today on the CX Files.
Yeah, you're welcome, Peter. You know, that background is a great conversation starter. And I have found that it's very rare that I don't end up talking with someone about either music, Star Wars, or Lego. So it's worked out really well for me.
It's worked out really well for our discussion too, because prior to actually hitting record, we were talking about all three, which is quite cool. Now, I will tell you, I share a deep affection for all of the different subjects that we've just talked about, all three of them. I actually am involved with another podcast you may or may not know called Cold War Conversations. This is in my off work time, which is curated by my good friend Ian Sanders, who's based in Manchester, and funnily enough has a connection to the CX industry too. Just we found this out by chance. But anyway, my desk is covered in different Cold War elements of memorabilia. I'll show you one here. This is, I don't know if you can see it, but it's a former East German sign telling people not to go any further because you're coming into the GDR. This is on my coffee mug. And I've got a little visual here of the Berlin Wall before it came down. So, you know, I'm keeping up. I don't think I'm keeping up as much as I need to in terms of your amazing backdrop, but we're here to talk a little bit about you. And we're here to talk a little bit about your role and your involvement in the CX industry, both as a professional and as a podcaster. So question number one, Rob, I'm going to preface this by a quote my good friend Jim Farnsworth, who's been around our industry in the United States and around the world, said to me one time many, many years ago. He said, nobody graduates university and decides they're going to go into the contact center or the customer experience business. And I would tend to agree. We all fall into it. How did you fall into it?
I mean, that is very resonant as far as I'm concerned. I thought I had things made in my early 30s. I was working for...
Didn't we all? Didn't we all?
Yeah, right. I was working for one of the largest banks in the United States in their wholesale mortgage division. I, wore a suit and tie to work every day. I thought I was making pretty good money. I was in a frontline managerial role. I had been relocated to the Twin Cities, and then 2008 came along. And my whole world turned upside down. Fast forward about a year and a half, and I needed a job. I ended up in St. Louis because my wife's work took us there. And I took an agent role at Convergys. That's now known as Concentrix because a series of mergers have continually gone through. But I was a frontline agent. I remember showing up to class still wearing the same work clothes I had been wearing. So I'm wearing, French cuff shirts and ties and slacks, which really kind of stood out. And I'll never forget the first time that I sat down to nest, YJack, whatever you want to call it, with live calls. The gentleman that I was sitting next to was a number of years younger than me, pretty buff, and had a tattoo across his forehead that read "Nothing to Prove." And I was like, what have I gotten myself into? But as you know, and as a lot of people in this industry know, there's a great opportunity to move forward within this industry. And so before I knew it, I was training, and then I was doing leadership development, and I was traveling all over the country and helping different site leadership uh, perform better by identifying coaching opportunities up and down the leadership ladder. And then in 2016, I made a move to a smaller family-owned company, Customer Direct, still in the BPO space, US-based, but on a much smaller scale. And I got to really help kind of create things from a training perspective, a quality perspective. And then one of the things that I really was trying to do from a quality perspective was figure out how we could take the sample size that we were getting with. At one time, I had a team of 5 people. All they did was listen to phone calls and grade phone calls and provide coaching notes. But I knew based off of our business that wasn't enough. And I tried to find technologies that would help us analyze calls. But it just wasn't there. The tech wasn't there. And interestingly enough, over the last few years, we built our own tech to do exactly that. That's where Happitu came from. So Happitu actually started as a division of Customer Direct. Today, it's spun off. It's its own company. But it really was a way for me in particular, but not just me, to accomplish some things that we have always known in the contact center industry was kind of that thing we struggled to do really well. And that was understand how we're performing and, what our customers are actually talking about. So that's how I got into the business.
That's quite a story. And it's just amazing how you were able to parlay the whole 2008 experience with the banking sector as a means of getting into CX. And I hear so many different stories like yours, maybe not identical from a 2008 global meltdown perspective, but it's just funny how we all fall into it. And I always say, once you've fallen into the pit, you never actually want to climb out because it's so much fun. Yeah. The people I've met in CX are probably amongst the best I've met anywhere in any sector. And there's just something warm about the space I've never found about any other vertical. So in terms of your podcast, Rob, Next in Queue is probably one of the most popular ones out there, alongside the CX Files, of course. I had to say that. But no, honestly, I mean, it's constantly ranked as one of the CX podcasts that everybody needs to have on their weekly listening queue. Can you talk a little bit about what prompted you to launch the podcast? What made you want to get on the air to talk about some of the different elements of CX that you're seeing trend-wise and what's going on in practice?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, it didn't necessarily start out that way. I listened to a show when we were all in lockdown called Get Out of Rap. So I'm sure Martin Teasdale's show.
Absolutely. Yeah, know Martin quite well.
Yeah. And I loved what he was doing. It's very UK focused for obvious reasons. But I loved what he was doing. I love the conversations he was having. And at the same time, we were really launching with Happitu. I was getting more and more involved on LinkedIn, and I was trying to figure out, how do I engage with LinkedIn? And video content seemed to be a really good way to do that. And so I thought, well, surely I can do this. I'll do what Martin's doing, kind of. And I started my first season just really talking to people in the contact center industry. And that worked really well for me as a way to just kind of get my feet wet. It was a way that I didn't have to do a lot of prep. I could just look at someone's LinkedIn profile, and we just kind of talked about people's careers. Eventually, I decided that I wanted to do more with the podcast. I wanted to broaden the scope of the topics. I wanted to focus on all kinds of different aspects of businesses. including the broader CX landscape, not just contact centers, but all of the things involved with CX, with customer success, with product development, with, you know, training, and just all the things. And so after a year of doing that weekly podcast, I changed the format up a little bit. And while I still talk to people in the contact center space, I really, and this is my little cheat code, I talk to people I want to learn from. And so that can be in a variety of different things. I talk to people that I find interesting, that have a different angle or expertise than I do. And I bring that to the audience, and I hope it resonates with them.
So in terms of the people that you bring on the show, the people that you want to learn from, and by the way, I love that. I think that's an outstanding way of positioning the types of individuals that you want to come on next in queue. You want people to have opinions. You want them to be thought-provoking. You want them probably to be, in some cases, a little bit in left field, if I'm interpreting what you're saying right.
Sometimes, yeah.
So, Rob, what are you finding since you launched the podcast? What are the common themes that seem to be coming up more often than not? What's bubbling under the surface in the industry that you're picking up on that not all of your guests, but perhaps many of your guests are discussing with you?
I think the biggest thing that you find is that people in the CX space recognize that employee experience is the basis of everything related to CX. And so there is, for people who really care about CX, they really care about the employee experience and are focused on making that better. That doesn't always mean that there aren't battles to fight and that they're able to make things happen the way that they think they should. But that's what I see a lot. And then, of course, the other thing, and this plays into that employee experience, is really the rise of AI just in the last year and a half, and what that means for employee experience and customer experience, and how do we integrate the new emerging technologies into our tech stack that actually does continue to create great customer experiences, not just find ways to save money.
You know, sticking on that AI element for a second here, Rob, it's interesting because I agree. I've never seen a hype cycle like I have the last 12 months, ever since the advent of ChatGPT at the end of 2022. But I don't know about you. I'm starting to get a real pushback when it comes to Gen AI right now from people across the CX space. It's not lived up to what they were expecting. The functionality is limited. They don't see how they can actually apply it. They don't see how companies that are promoting their Gen AI capabilities are coming to the table and providing them with what they need from a CX standpoint. Effectively, I'm hearing more often than not too, deployments have been made and they've been half-baked, and it's actually leading to an erosion of customer experience. Let's segue a little bit onto that for a second. What's your take on this whole debate right now we're seeing around the Gen AI phenomenon that has been hyped up so much?
Well, let's start with the brilliant move that OpenAI made to make ChatGPT, among other tools, open to the public and essentially free if you just wanted to play around with it. That was a brilliant move. That's a move that drug dealers have been using for many generations, right? Let me get that first taste free. The reality is, running a large language model is not cheap. It's incredibly resource intensive. Doing it well is expensive, particularly if you want to do it at scale. And so while some of us were playing around with Chat GPT and making poems about CX in the voice of Dr. Seuss, for instance. That's not a real business application, and it's not something that you do at scale. And so what businesses are trying to figure out now is, how do I balance the cost, which, by the way, there's some issues with transparency around the cost, because the pricing model, when you're using the APIs for things like ChatGPT, it's not as easy to understand as I think a lot of people wanted it to be or are used to. And so finding really good use cases to apply that technology to balance the cost and what you get out of it is where I think we are today. And there are good use cases, but they're a lot more limited than I think a lot of people thought. And so there are also lesser technologies that will allow you to accomplish the same thing far more cost efficiently than just throwing stuff at a large language model and saying, spit me out some data. So I think that's where we are today. I think we'll continue to evolve that, but that's my basic take on it.
It's funny what you just said there about how there's other solutions that perhaps aren't as cool or funky in the popular narrative. They can do just as good, if not better. And it takes me back to a story from when I was working in a different industry. This is in the year 2000. And I was at a business conference in a hotel in France, in the south of France. And we realized we needed a file from the office, or we need some information. And we were all trying to figure out how in 2000 we could get someone to email the information to us and receive the email. That was the big thing, because hotel internet wasn't a thing back then. Wi-Fi wasn't a thing. We were trying to arrange with the hotel front desk, could they receive an email on our behalf and print this out? And then somebody finally said, why don't you just get them to fax it?
Yeah.
And it kind of like light bulb over the head. Stop looking for the cool, funky, sexy way of transmitting this information and just go with what you've got. Go with what works. And it's so true. So I think this leads us into a really good point here, Rob. When we're thinking a little bit about what enterprises need to be considering, what they need to be paying attention to as we go through 2024, there's a lot of anger out there around CX and how people, no matter what the industry, feel that they're being treated by firms that they're buying goods and services from. There's, I think, probably a level of plumbing that's happened in the customer service indices, not just index, but indices in the US and the United Kingdom, that we just don't seem to be able to eradicate. If you're counseling an enterprise on what their CX strategy needs to be, based on your own opinions and what you've been able to glean from some of your podcast guests, what would you say the priorities need to be for an enterprise CX decision maker as we round out the rest of the year?
Peter, I think the first thing is focus on your people and make sure that your people are equipped to provide great experiences. The next thing, and I'm a firm believer in this, a lot of people will tell you people want wow experiences. They want to be blown away. Look, that's nice. I love it when I have an amazing experience, but what I really want are consistently good experiences that don't make me go, what the heck was that? That's where we need to put our efforts, is making sure we do the basics really well. I just posted a link about an NFL game, and it doesn't matter about the NFL. It's just about sports in general, right? Any coach will tell you that what you focus on first is the fundamentals. No matter what sport you're playing, get the fundamentals right. Do those really well, and then we'll worry about the fancy stuff after that. And I think that's the issue that enterprises, Gen AI is an example of this, right? We see the shiny new thing and we rush out to do it without fixing the fundamentals first. And so I would just encourage every business to look at, how do we perform with the fundamentals? And if that's not good right now, let's fix that. And then we can look at what we can do beyond that.
Yeah. And in my opinion, being able to get those fundamentals right is so, so important. And funny story here, just to give a bit of a parlay to it. I, in my off work time, enjoy doing contact sports, boxing specifically. And the other day, I started with my coach doing kickboxing because I thought, we're exercising the upper body. Let's see what we can do with the lower body. And it was funny, the exercises he had me beginning. I just wanted to get in and start kicking the bag and doing kicking some pads. And he's like, no, he goes, we can't do that until we get the fundamentals down pat. When we get the fundamentals around the movement and around the dexterity, right, then we can start doing that. But he says, don't expect that we're going to be doing this for at least a couple of weeks. And I thought that was a fascinating way of looking at what you just said. If you forget the fundamentals and you try jumping into solutions that are associated with the big shiny object, it's probably not going to go well.
You're absolutely right, Peter. It reminds me of the Karate Kid just now.
Yeah.
It's right balance. It's getting those basic movements down, and it feels like work because it is.
Yeah. And congratulations, Rob Dwyer. You win the gold medal for a 1980s reference on this podcast. So congratulations. I love that. Woohoo! So, Rob, I'm going to finish off our discussion talking a little bit about the ecosystem of companies that are selling into the enterprise CX space. Now, we've got two distinct branches. We've got CX Tech and we've got the BPO CX community. Now, you have the unique position of being aligned or affiliated with both those branches. So my question to you is, what do organizations, whether it's a CX tech firm or a BPO firm, need to do to stand out in what I think has become a highly competitive, but unfortunately too, in many cases, a highly genericized market? What are enterprises looking for, and how can an organization selling into them really make themselves distinct?
Well, you're absolutely right that there's a bit of commoditization that has come with both the technology side and the services side. It's really difficult if you're working with a partner that is focused solely on price, which often happens. And the only way to make yourself stand out, if that is the sole focus, is to give them the price that they want. What you need to be looking for, regardless of whether you are offering software services or you're offering people services, is to find partnerships, to find people that want to help elevate an experience for their brand. Price is important. It's important for everyone. We all take that into consideration. But the most important thing for a brand, hopefully, if they really care about their brand, is the experience that they're delivering. And then they'll pick partners, whether those are vendors or BPOs, whatever the case may be, that help them achieve that brand image, that help them achieve that experience that they want to provide to their customers. And so I would always be focused on, how are we helping you achieve that with your customers? And that's what I look for. I think that's what a lot of companies look for. Not all of them. And let's be honest about it. Not all of them are looking for that. But the ones that I want to work with are looking for that. And I think if you care about the level of service that you provide, or the amazing tech that you provide, or whatever the case may be, that's what you should be looking for. Brands that want partners.
Okay. Well, Rob Dwyer, thank you very much for the time today and for the chat. It's been highly illuminating for me. And before we go, just one last question. Next in Queue, as we've talked about, is just a superb podcast. Where can our listeners find you on the interweb?
I mean, you can find it in all the places, right? You can find me on LinkedIn. I am pretty active there. The podcast is in all the places, right? So I host it on Spotify. You can find it on Apple Podcasts. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on Google Podcasts, which is apparently not going to be a thing for very long. It's going to be YouTube podcast now, but any place you listen to podcasts, it should be there. If it's not, let me know. I'll figure out why it's not, and I'll get it there.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time, my man, and we will talk to you very soon.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.